Let's look at the internal structure of the spinal cord. This is a transverse section, and it says here of the lumbar spinal cord. You'll notice this picture would not be the lumbar spinal cord. But there is some variation throughout the spinal cord. We're not going to get into the specific variation between different levels of the spinal cord. But you'll notice again, this is the wrong image to represent a lumbar spinal cord. I believe your textbook does indeed have the correct picture. So we will disregard this picture and look right here. What this this actual cross section of a spinal cord shows us is that the outer edges are where you would find white matter, whereas internally is where you would find gray matter. Now again, I notice that the gray matter appears more brown and the white matter doesn't quite appear white, but this out here is the white matter of the spinal cord, and in the inside is the gray matter. The white matter is often divided up into what we would call columns. This is the anterior white column, posterior white column, and then these are the lateral columns. The gray matter, we use horns to represent different areas. Posterior gray horn, there's a little bit of a lateral gray horn, and then an anterior gray horn. There's also a couple grooves on each side. There's a sulcus in the back, posterior median sulcus. There's an anterior median fissure along the front or anterior surface. That's one way you can typically determine the anterior and posterior. Down the front of the spinal cord, there's a much deeper fissure, whereas in the posterior, there's a shallow sulcus. What's more important is to understand what kind of function does the white matter serve versus the gray matter, which we'll be talking about on subsequent slides. You'll also notice there's a cross kind of bar here called the gray commissure. Commissure is a way that neurons can get from one side to the other side. So there's a lot of neurons that cross over. To cross over to the other side, we often use the word decussate. So a lot of nerve impulses might enter one side of the spinal cord, but then decussate to the other side of the spinal cord in order to go up to the opposite side of the brain, because the brain controls largely the opposite side of the body. The brain works contralaterally. So sensory information coming in on the right side has to cross over to get to the left side of the brain. You'll also notice there's a central canal. That's just a small little canal that runs the length of the spinal cord. There's actually cerebrospinal fluid in that canal as well. Let's look at how the spinal cord might work. What we have here is just a schematic representing neurons and how those neurons would transmit their information into the spinal cord, how it might go up or down in the spinal cord, and then how information might, or nerve impulses, might extend out from the spinal cord. So if we follow the numbers here, we see that number 1 shows these blue neurons emanating from the skin. So these would be examples of sensory or afferent neurons that are getting stimulated by different stimuli. Maybe this one's a pressure sensor, and this one's maybe a pain sensor, maybe this one's a temperature sensor. But they're going to have their receptors for those stimuli, and they will get stimulated and produce action potentials, and those action potentials will be transmitted in the nerve. So right here would represent a spinal nerve that has these sensory neurons in it, as well as these motor neurons shown in green and red. These neurons are going to transmit into the spinal cord, and this structure here that allows these sensory nerves to enter that spinal cord is known as the dorsal root. If you recall, dorsal also means posterior. This is the back or posterior region of the spinal cord, where this is the anterior. So this is known as the dorsal root. You'll also notice that these little round circles represent the cell bodies. And there's a cluster of all these cell bodies here in this dorsal root. And what that forms is a somewhat swollen area of that root. And that swollen area is known as the dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion, if you recall, is where you have a lot of cell bodies in the PNS. So all those blue neurons, which are sensory neurons, are entering via the dorsal root. This is what I would call the on-ramp to the spinal cord. Right? In order to get onto that or into that spinal cord, you use this ramp. You'll notice in a minute that this ramp is the off-ramp. This is how you get out of the spinal cord, the ventral root. If you were to damage a dorsal root or sever that, that would block all these sensory neurons from transmitting into the spinal cord. Then you see that some of these neurons are going to go, well, they're all going to eventually end up in the white matter, because the white matter is how you get up. You get up to the brain. So you'll notice this neuron is going into that white matter there, so it can transmit up. This looks like the middle one is making a synapse with a neuron that's able to send it over or decussate over to the other side and then go up. It all depends on what sensory information that is. We also have one forming a synapse and then sending maybe a stimulus right back out to maybe control this muscle. So maybe we are sensing a pencil or pen in our skin, and we're immediately controlling the muscles to move that pencil. So that's the sensory component there. The motor impulses, notice we've got in blue or in red here, motor neuron impulses coming down from the brain. So maybe that's your cerebral cortex initiating nerve impulses that are going to lead to muscle contraction. So we've got the nerve impulse coming down the white matter, making a synapse with a motor neuron. It says right here this is a somatic motor neuron, so it should eventually end up at a skeletal muscle, and it does. Notice this green one they call an autonomic motor neuron. It might come out that same root, that same ventral root, but since it's an autonomic neuron, it's going to be going to either cardiac muscle, a smooth muscle organ, this is showing the bladder, or it could be going to a gland. So notice all the motor neurons are in the ventral root. So the ventral root contains outgoing motor fibers, whereas that dorsal root contained incoming sensory fibers. If you damage or sever that ventral root, it would paralyze. So it would block transmission to this muscle. It would paralyze, say, the bladder, or it would paralyze and not be able to reach the heart and control the heart muscle. So those roots are either sensory or motor. Where they come together, that's the actual spinal nerve, and that is considered a mixed nerve because it contains now both sensory and motor neurons. So this is a really good representation of how the spinal cord is going to work. It gets sensory information, then figures out where that needs to go. It gets motor information from the brain, and then figures out how to get that out to the effector. Okay? The next thing we're going to do is talk about specific areas in the white matter that are known as tracts. And we're going to do this on a separate video. This video is going to contain a lot of the physiology relating to the white matter of the spinal cord.